Hi, I'm Remy Desai, editor here at Move Smartly. In our episode today, we're going to sit down with John for another one of our semi-regular chats about the biggest ideas that John is thinking, writing, and talking to the media about right now. In our last episode, the first of these kind of chats, John and I talked about one of the key aspects of our housing crisis here in Canada, the high price that renters are paying for that crisis. That episode proved to be very popular. We got a lot of great comments from you on our YouTube channel, our Twitter accounts, and via email. So thank you. Keep the comments and engagement coming. And if you haven't seen that episode, I invite you to check it out. You'll see my full introduction to John's work there. For today's chat, John and I are going to talk about another critical aspect of Canada's housing crisis, just when and why it became the case that our incomes are no longer a good income or a decent income is no longer good enough to be able to afford a home, not only in Canada's most expensive markets like Toronto and Vancouver, but in many other Canadian markets as well. And just what our markets are running on, what fuels them and the ever higher prices if it's not just our incomes. So I hope you'll find this episode equally interesting. If you enjoy our show, please hit the subscribe button. And now on to our episode. Hi, welcome to the Move Smartly channel. I'm here with my co-host, John Pisalis in Toronto. We're both in Toronto. How are you, John?
Hello again. Very good. It's the weather's pretty nice lately in Toronto. So have our summer attire on today.
Yes, loving it. So this is going to be the second in our chats about what you're thinking and writing about right now. Mm-hmm. And in our last episode, we focused more on one part of the housing crisis. When we say housing crisis, we focused on renters and the situation they're facing. And today we're going to look a little bit more at what you've been writing about, the other part of the housing crisis, which is affordability. Now, what's happened with affordability? So there was a time when there was a rule of thumb that, you make a certain income, that income allows you to borrow a certain amount, i.e. take out a mortgage, and you can afford X amount of house at a certain price. So, that was the rule of thumb, and it held, our parents knew it, that was the rule for a long time. But then we saw, 10 years ago, home prices were at 6 times income. Now they're at 10 times income, average income. And our ability to borrow stays at 5 times income. So this rule is being shattered. This connection, this idea that what we make was a constraint on how much houses could be, has totally been ripped apart in the Toronto area. And yet our market continues to increase in price and it's not collapsing. Mm-hmm. So what exactly is happening when it comes to affordability?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, a common assumption for the longest time has always been that house prices are constrained by income, right? And they are to some extent. I mean, mortgage borrowing is constrained by income. It doesn't necessarily mean house prices are constrained by income. And when we think about what are the key drivers that got us to this point, there are a lot of theories, and maybe it's just best start off with kind of the most common, one of the common arguments I often hear, which is that it is cheap and easy credit that kind of got us to where we are. And cheap and easy credit are two slightly different things, not completely different. Cheap meaning declining interest rates is kind of what brought us here. And this idea that as interest rates fall, we can borrow more. And this really helped kind of push home prices up even higher. Easy credit has more to do with the availability and access of debt. And people who make this argument, a good example of that would be, for example, during the US financial crisis or just before that during their bubble, when basically anyone was getting mortgages. It didn't matter if you had no job or no income. You're getting a mortgage to buy an investment property. That is an example of easy credit. And how if credit is too available and too accessible, it can inflate house prices. And I think this is a common argument I often hear on Twitter from Canadians, that it is access to credit and in part easy and cheap credit that has kind of contributed to the growth in house prices.
Right, the era of the ninja loans, no income, exactly. No job. Right. So in Canada, it seems that a lot of people have also felt that maybe easy access to credit has been part of the problem. You just wrote about this very view that was shared by Conservative federal MP Michael Chong recently in the House of Commons. So why don't we listen to what he has to say here?
Well, quite simply, the government mismanaged a number of macroeconomic policies through Finance Canada, through CMHC, and through OSFI. For example, they allowed mortgage credit to grow at an unbelievable annual compounded rate over the last 8 years, far in excess of inflation, population growth, and other measures like productivity growth. And as a result, household debt in Canada has grown from 80% of GDP some 15 years ago to 107% of GDP today. That's a 27% jump in household debt in Canada. That's almost 30%. That's a 30% jump, more than a 30% jump in household debt in real terms per household in this country over the last 15 years, most of it under this government's watch. And all because this government failed to regulate the growth in mortgage credit through OSFI, through Finance Canada, and through CMHC.
So, John, it seems that Chong is criticizing specifically easy credit, as we were saying before, that the regulatory institutions he's mentioning together make it too easy to qualify for a mortgage in Canada. So what do you make of this argument?
It seems like a very odd argument for an MP to make. Anyone who's tried to get a mortgage in Canada, especially from a big bank, knows that it's not overly easy. At the end of the day, even with rates dropping during the sort of the COVID pandemic, at the end of the day, households could generally not borrow much more than 4.5 to 5 times their household income. And that is a constraint. And even though interest rates plummeted to almost zero, this constraint still held because we have a stress test in Canada, right? And people were qualifying at over 5% when getting their pre-approval for their mortgage, not at 1.5 or 2%, which is what they were actually paying. And this stress test effectively constrains how much people can borrow. And that was really capped at 4.5 to 5 times the household income. And if we look at historical trends, the Bank of Canada tracks the percentage of households who borrowed more than 4.5 times their income. So basically, generally that group that is, probably closer to 5 times their income. And they track that because, in their view, these are the most vulnerable home buyers because they've sort of maxed out on their debt by borrowing 5 times their income. And if we kind of look at, what percentage of home buyers are borrowing more than 4.5 times their income, it hasn't changed very much over time. It's kind of bounced around between 15 to 20% of buyers. It did accelerate during COVID to 25% of buyers. And partly because, buyers were willing to max out on what the bank would lend them because they knew the rate would be much lower. You know what I mean? Because there's two parts of the constraint. One is how much are banks willing to lend you? The other part is at what point do I feel house poor, right? So even if banks will lend you 5 times your income, a lot of buyers in the past would borrow less because they didn't want to feel house poor. Whereas during the pandemic, a few more people kind of stretched that budget because rates were so low. So the percentage of households that are borrowing more than 4.5 times their income hasn't changed very much. So to say that, it's so easy to get a mortgage and it's just easy access to credit that has fueled house prices, is a little bit of a crazy argument because, again, our borrowing is constrained by our income, quite frankly. And home prices have appreciated far more rapidly than our ability to borrow, quite frankly.
Okay, but we know that house prices are at 10 times our income. So if we aren't borrowing enough or able to borrow enough to get there, how are we buying homes?
Well, okay, so certainly incomes have gone up and, part of it is driven by income, but the bigger factor is if you just look at trends, and the Bank of Canada has this great page on the website where they track financial indicators. And one of the ones that they look at is effectively, the average loan to value on all mortgages in Canada at origination. And loan to value, which basically means, how much of a mortgage is someone taking on relative to the purchase price of the home. The flip side is effectively how much of a down payment are they coming to the table. And in 2014, the average loan to value was close to 76%, which means that buyers were coming to the table with about a 24% down payment on average, right? This is sort of national, and this is for new mortgages, not sort of renewals or people who've had their home for 20 years. And since then, the loan to value ratio in Canada has plummeted to 68%, which means buyers are coming to the table with a 32% down payment. So basically, prices are going up, but people are actually coming to the table with more capital. This to me is a massive shift. And one of the reasons why I think that, the bigger driver of home prices, obviously credit growth, all of this stuff is important. We can't say that this doesn't matter. Of course, this is contributing to house prices. But if we're trying to figure out, is it, mortgage growth or capital of people coming to the table, it looks like it is actually capital that is kind of being a bigger contributor to the boom that we've been seeing in house prices. And I'll say, you can even look at this just very simply. If we look at the statistics for Toronto, right? And we say, hey, look at the Banks of Canada's data and say, okay, back in 2014, let's look at the average home price. And based on the Bank of Canada's data, the average buyer was coming to the table with a 24% down payment versus looking at today's average price where people are coming with a 32% down payment. What you end up finding when you look at those stats is that the amount of the down payment that people are coming to the table with over that time has more than doubled. It's up by about 140%. Whereas the average mortgage amount on the average home in Toronto is up 80%. So almost just over half of what the growth is in down payment debt. So a down payment being brought to the table. So what we're finding is more people are coming with capital at the table, and capital is largely appears to be a bigger factor that's contributing to the growth, which intuitively makes sense because mortgage debt's constrained by income at 5 times. And if our home prices are increasing at a much faster rate, the only possible explanation is people are just coming with more capital.
All right. So where is this additional money coming from? We hear a lot of talk about the bank of mom and dad being a factor in the Toronto area. In your experience, is this a factor? Is this something you see, or is this something I'm assuming it's hard to see in the data? Maybe you see it in your work.
Yeah, it's very hard to say. We do see it on the ground. People who are getting gifts from family, those gifts have been much bigger over the past few years than they were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, anyone who's getting a gift from family, those gifts were in the 5 figures, 30, 40, $50,000. Now we're seeing gifts in the 6 figures generally, so hundreds of thousands of dollars, and sometimes even more than that. And where is this money coming from? I think it just all depends. Like for some households, it is just wealth. You know what I mean? They're just wealthy families. They've saved money. So, the parents are generally kind of gifting or advancing funds to their kids early. That's one example. Some households, that have most of their wealth tied up in their homes are refinancing their homes, getting a line of credit or a mortgage to help their kids buy a home. And that's an example of, say, a parent would just take on an extra $100,000 of debt to help their kids buy a home. And it's a bit of a mix, I'd say. And then some people who are relocating here are coming with capital. They have successful businesses overseas. They want to relocate to Canada, and they have capital. So it's a bit of a mix. And obviously not everybody does, but certainly the ones that are getting into this market who have $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 as a down payment are coming from households their own or families with the means to come up with that much capital.
Interesting. So is you mentioned one bucket there, one group of people who maybe are using the properties they already have to refinance them, tap into maybe a HELOC, a loan against the home to buy other properties, either a parent helping a child, or you'll remember that there's been a lot of advertising, given how cheap credit has been since 2008 about, hey, it's easy, buy one property, a pre-condo sale, use that, make an appreciation, leverage that to buy another. So there was a time when cheap credit, not easy, but cheap, was a big part of the story, and we've seen rock bottom rates start in 2008 because of the attempt globally to fight the subprime, the U.S. origination subprime mortgage, which led to the global financial collapse, which led to governments around the world really lowering their interest rates in an effort to revive economies. So since 2008, we saw the lowest interest rates. That ended as our latest rate cycle started to increase just last year. So is cheap credit not part of the story, or, are you saying not all of it?
No, it's a great question. I think it definitely was. I mean, we don't have cheap credit today, so it was part of the story, certainly, in particular, the years even leading up to COVID. Because it was a lot cheaper to borrow off of your HELOC, and a lot of people were doing that, and buying investment properties or and that is a very common thing, or helping their kids down payments. So that is an example, certainly, where, debt is contributing in theory. I mean, it depends on how you look at it. If I'm borrowing $100,000 from my house, I mean, it's my equity, but if you're borrowing it, you're sort of taking on debt to help your child, say, and that was for sure a contributing factor. Is a contributing factor to a lot of the people who are taking out debt, buying investment properties during the COVID boom. But I think the more important point is that it is very clearly not all about cheap debt, and I say very clearly because we have a very recent example in 2023 where interest rates have skyrocketed, and buyers are being stress tested in the 7% range, in some cases close to 8%, and we saw the housing market just heat up in 2023, and not just be competitive, but prices actually increase and accelerate. And, I know some people say, well, that's just because there weren't a lot of homes for sale and so on and so forth. I mean, why it happens partly is important, but at the end of the day, prices were rising. You know what I mean? Prices were appreciating. People were lining up, 15, 20 buyers bidding on homes and competing on homes when rates were, over 5%, which is not what anyone would have imagined when we thought, like, what would the spring market of 2023 look like? I don't know a single person who thought the market would, be on fire. And it was for 4, 5, 6 months. It has obviously slowed down since then. So again, I think that challenges this assumption that it's just cheap money that's fueling the housing market. At the end of the day, when you overwhelm the market with demand, which is what Canada's done, what you end up getting are, the households that are sort of in the wealthier end of the income distribution who can still afford it, even when rates are 5 and 6%. And this is really what is, helping to contribute to sort of the hot market we saw last year, earlier this year. So it's not just a credit or debt issue, I'd say.
Now, you've been writing for a long time about your concerns about home prices, the growing detachment from income. And now, I think for the first time in a long time, I'm hearing housing crisis from all levels of government. It's taken a long time, but, I think we are starting to see all major political parties and levels of government start to talk about the housing crisis. Now, in your opinion, what is one of the biggest changes? Like, if we just step back and say, okay, what are we feeling as a society so that, housing is now at the top of everybody's lips? What is the the change that we have felt. It seems like for a long time, there was
Mhm.
just this role that housing was going to play in our lives and a
Mhm.
way to get to it. But
Mhm.
now we feel something's really broken. And I'm wondering if your observation is around the same thing. It's, there's been a real shift.
Well, there has been. I mean, when we look at the statistics, everyone, it's kind of funny because when we talk about this, I hear people often arguing that this has been a 20-year problem. This isn't new. We've had a crisis since the early 2000s, which is a bit of a silly argument, because anyone who's been following the housing market for some time knows that we weren't using the word crisis 10 years ago. This is actually quite new. Before, I'd say, if you look at pre-construction house price stats, if you look at resale housing statistics, and I wrote a blog post about this, not a blog post, in my report, maybe 2-3 months ago, I don't even remember, it was titled, "When did the housing crisis start?" And it was very clear that, and you just look at the rate of appreciation in home prices. And when you do that, you see a very significant shift pre 2015, 2016 and post 2015, 2016. The average rate of growth for home prices before 2015 was something like 6% per year in the GTA, or 6.5%, which is still relatively high. But that has gone up to around, I think, 11%. And not only is it 11%, if we just look at the month, like the rate of appreciation over a long horizon, it was very rare before 2015 to see home prices up double digits year over year. I think something like only 5 or 6% of the months did we see a double digit appreciation in home prices. Whereas since 2015, that became the norm. And I can't even remember off the top of my head, I think it was like 2/3 of every month in this time period, home prices were rising by double digits, right? And there are a lot of factors that behind this, of course. I mean, we talked in the past, our population's booming. Part of it is when home prices are appreciating by double digits, when governments are sort of setting this expectation that the demand will keep exceeding the supply, no one wants to let go of their homes, right? Like the first question we get from anyone who's buying a home or already has one is, can I keep my current home? Like, I don't want to sell it, or my current condo. And what this does, of course, is just contributes to higher home prices, because you're taking that stock, you're no longer making it available for sale. You're renting it, which is, helping some families. But at the end of the day, it doesn't materially impact the market, because you still have, you have more people fighting for fewer homes. And that's kind of contributing to it. And this is partly why home prices have become out of reach in Canada and have accelerated to the level where they are today.
So, and this is a change, right, in Canadian society, in the sense that we often used to hear, well, that's London, that's New York, you have to be super, super rich to own.
Mm-hmm.
Are we getting there? And are you saying like this is where Canada is? And what does that mean for a society like Canada, which tells ourselves another story, which is that it's an equitable society and a place that you can get a foot up?
I think we have hit that point, and I do think you make an important point, and I think you even started the whole segment when you talked about how there was just this understanding, like, you work hard, you get a job, you have a decent income, and the middle class family can afford a home, or the middle class individual, and that has fallen apart now. When home prices are 10 times the median household income, not even individual income, that social contract we had with our government, effectively, the people who we elect to, obviously to manage our country and kind of look after society, ensure that we have adequate housing and adequate healthcare and all of these other things, that social contract is effectively broken, because when home prices are 10 times the median income, what that means is you have to have a ton of money, and either you are fortunate where you've just been successful and have made a ton of money. But what ends up happening is, for the most part, it's, the buyers are buyers who are coming from some capital and who have parents who are helping them buy a home. Like, it is unbelievably hard today to come from a household of renters to buy a home. And not to say that it's not impossible, of course it is, but it is a lot harder when home prices are 10 times income versus 6 times income. And on top of that, as we talked about in our last episode, when you have rents appreciating by 10 to 15% a year, it's harder for that rental household to even save for a down payment, right? So certainly we're getting to this point where, these expectations that we had from our government, in terms of what we can expect as middle class households or individuals are kind of falling apart. And, we're at a point where houses are not even just for the wealthiest households. They become assets. They become assets for the wealthiest individual and the wealthiest corporations. REITs buying up homes is happening all across the US and is happening in Canada as well. So there's like real estate income trusts just buying blocks of condominiums, blocks of houses, renting them up. And of course, wealthy individuals accumulating houses. And again, I tweeted the other day that our housing minister changed, and the one positive step is, at least Sean, unlike Ahmed Hussein in the past, Sean Fraser is not accumulating a portfolio of suburban homes, which is what he was doing. And it's not to say that there's anything illegal with that. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, he can do it, but it is not a positive look for a government. When our politicians are basically building investment portfolios of single family homes. I'm not talking about multiplexes and building housing, like single family homes. It's just problematic when they're doing that, when the average household is just having such a hard time getting into the market, right? And I think, as we touched on, I think on our last episode, this is really just a product of the fact that in Canada, we just value houses as a financial asset more than as a place to live and raise a family, I think. And I think that's one of the problems with where we're at.
So our last conversation ended with me asking you, when we were talking about the rental crisis, what would you have done 10 years ago? Now, I look at what you're saying about Canada. I hear you, and I think we're in for it, because Canada does see itself as a very fair country. That's been very important to our identity, and where people are relatively equal to each other. But our reality now is very different. But just like London, New York, the countries they're in, Canada is a capitalist country. So I'm wondering, what would you do now to change these things? Like, are we actually talking about targeting wealth, and how would we do that? Or are you talking more about trying to shift the incentives around owning housing as an asset? Like, I can't see many Canadians, as fair as we think we are, thinking wealth taxation and things like that are in the cards. And so now we're, you know what I mean? We're here. We're in this mess. What would you do now?
Man, that's a good question. I mean, I think the challenges with housing policies is that you cannot change course overnight. You have this, it's like a massive machine that builds momentum. And it's very hard to change direction, right? I don't think like wealth taxes, those types of things I mean, at the end of the day, we still have the problem of this mismatch of demand and supply, which is really fueling this rapid acceleration in prices and wealth inequality. I think where I disagree, and I think where I differ from most housing advocates, like most housing advocates, many of these YIMBY groups, just simply believe if you build more houses, everything will solve itself, right? And many of them are very supportive of the path, quite frankly, that we're on, of corporations buying home, wealthy individuals buying home, because in their worldview, more supply solves everything. The challenge is, In Canada, we're not triple, like the more supply solution means we have to triple the number of homes we build, which is never going to happen. A country cannot triple housing completions overnight. But on top of that, I think if you want to build, again, if this goes back to like a more equitable housing market, single family homes were originally built and intended to be owner occupied, right? And this is what we should be moving to. And if we want to move to that direction, you have to disincentivize corporations and wealthy individuals from buying single family homes and encourage them to invest in permanent rental housing, which is a better form of rental housing for tenants because there's more security. They can't get kicked out because the owner wants to flip the property or move in themselves, many of them say, or get rent evicted. So, permanent rental housing is a better solution than Canada's approach. And Canada's approach to building rental housing is backwards. Like most other countries do not build rental housing this way, which is, building single family homes that are bought by, investors. Most countries build permanent rental housing. And I think this is the path we should go on. So it's not just about more supply, it's kind of restructuring and thinking about who's buying our houses. And I think this is where I disagree with most housing advocates. I don't think more and more homes going to the wealthiest corporations, individuals is an ideal solution. And many of them do. And I think we should be moving towards something that actually works better for renters. Because when you have a market that works better for renters, it works better for households as well. And that's kind of why I'm talking about renters, because less of the homes we're building or more of the homes we're building end up being available to middle class families. All these suburban homes that Ahmed Hussein was buying could be bought by families. And if he wants to build a multiplex, all the power to him. That is what he should be building. That's what investors should be investing their money in. But I think it's a very long process to get to that point. And I think like last week's episode, I think my view is the minority one because Canada is a very, very real estate obsessed country. And I think it would, I don't know. I don't know what it would take to kind of unwind that or slow this obsession with buying single family homes.
Yes, well, in defense of YIMBY groups or the increased supply, they have been told, like we've been told here, we're not only very docile when it comes to our governments, we're docile with a lot of contracts. Canada has 6 big banks. They do whatever they want. Canada has Ontario has some major builders, which have a lot of sway and a direct line to our premier. And we trust they'll do the best for us, right? So, these YIMBY advocates have been told, oh, builders don't want to build, but you've got to incentivize them so they can build more units. So a lot of us have been like, okay, what do you need? What do you need? Please build us more housing under any terms.
Yeah.
So I think it is cultural. It's not just that we're naive. It's that we were told this is the only way. And I think this is something we'll have to explore further. Is it something like Singapore where every single additional property you own faces a different additional tax rate? And, and that just keeps climbing. Yeah. So, that's talking about disincentivizing holding multiple properties. Yeah. Maybe those are in certain classes in Canada. So if it's not a designated rental or a permanent rental, then that's what happens, but who would have the guts to bring that in? I mean, we can blame the politicians, but now I don't know how we are going to convince ourselves to take the medicine.
No, 100%.
So that's something we'll have to explore, right?
I mean, and to be clear, I mean, most of the, at least the density proposals that many of the YIMBY groups advocate for, I tend to agree with. I mean, I think higher density housing, makes for better cities. I don't think it is the solution to all our housing affordability crises. I mean, if you just look at many of the dense cities and the, superstar cities, they're all very dense and still very expensive. But it is still a solution we should be striving for because I think they just make for better cities. But yeah, I think it'll be a long process to make any major shifts when it comes to housing policy in Canada, especially on the supply side. I mean, those are very difficult and slow moving changes.
And demand side too, if it means more taxation and going after things that, we've always thought are fair game, fair
Well,
dues.
the demand side is easier to influence, but you're
Mhm.
right. I mean, if you're trying to cut the demand for housing or make it harder to borrow, I mean, that's not going to go over very well. But most
Right.
banks, not most banks, most politicians do not want to make it harder to borrow or harder to buy. In fact, many of them, are trying to make it a little bit easier for buyers through different schemes. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah. All right. So we are going to keep the conversation going. We will be back with another chat about John's big thoughts. You can keep your comments to us coming. So John is on Twitter at Twitter. Is it even called Twitter anymore?
It's going to
Sorry.
be X very soon, but yeah.
Okay. John is at X, at John Fasalis. We're there at Move Smartly. You can reach John at askjohn@movesmartly.com by email. You can reach me at editor@movesmartly.com. So thank you for joining us, and we'll be back with some more big ideas and conversations.